It is known that Avraham, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people, he's known and he's referred to as the Amud HaChesed. He's the pillar of loving kindness. There's a question which is asked. Avraham, his whole life, was selfless giving, indiscriminate. He didn't discern whether the person was worthy, not worthy. His home was open, and he would engage with anyone. And through his hospitality, he would enter into the discussion, have the dialogue, and he would succeed in convincing the person that the only way to understand existence is through that there's one omnipotent being which oversees everything, which wills everything. There's a question which is asked, Avraham, if his whole life was chesed, why is the Torah so specific and so exacting on the chesed of this week's reading? Torah tells us God appeared to Avraham on the third day of circumcision in Elone Mamre. And the Torah tells a story. He was sitting at the entrance of his tent at the hottest time of the day. 3 angels come in human form, and he runs towards them. He prostrates himself before them, and he offers them the shade of his tree. He offers them water to wash their feet. He offers them some bread. And ultimately, his hospitality is one of a kind. And the Torah puts these acts of hospitality under the microscope. Whatever he did himself, the Jewish people merited it to come directly from God. Whatever he provided through intermediary, it came to us through an intermediary. For instance, the reason why we merited the clouds of glory for 40 years in the desert, which protected us from all the elements and provided many other things, was because he offered the shade of his tree. That's something he offered himself. The water was offered through an intermediary to wash their feet. So the water in the desert came from the intermediary. Moshe had to break the rock to extract water from the rock. It did not come naturally by itself. Avraham offered the bread. We merited the manna, the man. Every day for 40 years, the manna fell naturally. Friday, there was a double portion. Because everything is measure for measure. Avraham does it himself. God is directly involved. Otherwise, through an intermediary, the benefits through an intermediary, therefore, the water came through Moshe Rabbeinu. Why is the Torah so specific and so exacting? And many other things, other aspects of what happened here. So I think the most obvious answer is, although Avraham did chesed his whole life, selfless chesed, there's no recording of that chesed. Until the portion of Vayero, where do we find the Torah discusses Avram's hospitality, his method of outreach? What was the context of his dialogue of monotheism? No mention. We only know this because the Midrash, Chazal, revealed to us that's what he's involved in. But in the actual discussion, the text, it's not part of the text. The only text which the Torah discusses and speaks about his hospitality, how he was sitting on the third day of circumcision in pain, that because there were no wayfarers coming, he was pained by this. So God sent 3 angels in human form. and he didn't realize these were angels, he provided his hospitality. So that itself seemingly confirms that everything else that he'd done until now, which we only know not from the text, through the oral law, which is through the Midrash, through the Talmud, evidently it doesn't rate compared to this. It's infinitesimal compared to this. There's something special about this, which all the Chesed did all his life, until the age of 99, is not considered anything significant versus what happened at this moment. Seemingly, it's obvious from the text, because there's no mention of his hospitality until this moment. That's what I think, and that's where I understand it. New question, but why? If in fact he did offer his hospitality, not discerning whether you're worthy or not worthy, selflessly, continuously, why doesn't there share this with us? Evidently, it's for a reason. And that's why the Torah only shares and reveals in the text what happened with the angels after he was circumcised. We had mentioned that Avraham himself was the location of the divine presence. When did he become the location of the divine presence? After he was circumcised. Before he was circumcised, there was a communication between God and Avraham by telling him, leave your homeland, leave your birthplace, leave your family, and go to the location that I will show you. He was 75 years old at that time. From then until 99, when he became circumcised, he was not yet the Merkava. He was not the location of the divine presence, which was the equivalent of the Holy of Holies, as we discussed yesterday. It was not that. Can you imagine a person gives charity, and you have Moshe Reichman gives charity. The Reichman family. Person goes, he puts a nickel in the charity box every day, 6 days a week. Maybe Friday, he puts a dime in. Because Saturday, he can't put the additional nickel in the box. Reichman doesn't speak about his charity. Reichman gives $131 million a year to charity. And now they honor Reichman for being this great, not philanthropist, Baltstoker. Supports Torah causes globally. He makes differences. He moves mountains. And this person who puts a nickel in the box every day can't understand, why is Reichman being honored? Why isn't he acknowledged? He should be acknowledged. He's also charitable. He puts a nickel in every day. But if you understand the difference between what you do and what he does, Reichman's charity not only quantitatively does it move mountains, in its essence, not only is it mega numbers, but look what it's doing. Look what it's changing. It's changing the face of the world. The world's a different world because of his infusion of this capital in the various projects which he underwrote. What did the nickels accomplish? But the man doesn't understand it. Do we talk about, when I talk about people are worthy of acknowledgement because of the philanthropy, do I talk about the nickel and dime person? Which his charity makes no difference other than the mitzvah. It begins with the mitzvah, ends with the mitzvah. He did a mitzvah, giving charity. But the charity made a difference, which he changed the face of the map, spiritually speaking, didn't. Avraham Avinu, after he was circumcised, he became a different being. As we said, when they had the hay added to his name, he became a different dimension of existence. He was a new creation. Now God is with him. God is his location. Now we're talking about mega effect. Now we're talking about it's not the dollar, it's who you are. We find Yitzchak was the second patriarch. And after Avraham passed away, he was in the Philistine area, and there was a famine. And God comes to Yitzchak and says, do not leave the land, because Yitzchak was considered going to Egypt as his father did when there was a famine. God says, despite the famine, remain in the land, do not leave. That year, although it was a famine year, the yield of his plantings was 100-fold of a normal year, which was not a famine year. What does he do with the profits? He invested. There's profits. He has herds and flocks and slaves, money, gold, silver. He's become a very wealthy man. He became, and the Torah uses the term, Godel Mi'od, very great. Not only was he wealthy, he became very great. He had a level of renown. So Rashi cites the Midrash. What was the level of renown? People would say that we prefer the dung of Yitzchak's donkeys or mules than the gold of Avimelech. You take Yitzchak's dung and you put it on your field, gold grows out of the field. You take Avimelech's gold and you invest it, and what's the return? The return is dung. So people said, who has the Midas touch? Yitzchak. So not only was he wealthy, wealth-wise, he had renown, so he became very great. Avimelech couldn't handle the competition. Could you imagine? His dung is gold and my gold is dung. Couldn't handle it. Now the question is, why was Yitzchak's dung gold? You know who Yitzchak was? Yitzchak was the location of the divine presence. Yitzchak is the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. Being that anything he touches surpasses anything within the finite. How does dung turn into gold? How is dung bracha? Because if God is your location, everything you are and everything you represent is blessing, is unlimited. That's the reason. So whatever chesed Avraham had done before he was circumcised, before he became this new being, which is equivalent to the new creation, as we said, the hay, it was added to his name, because all existence came into being through the spirituality of that letter hay. Avraham became that new being. And because he became that new being, now God dwells on the terrestrial, on a personal level. Now, his hospitality, his chesed, it's a different dimension of chesed. Now it moves worlds. It creates worlds. His power base is something phenomenal. Whatever he did earlier, as I say, the word pales is not enough to say its level of limitation. Therefore, the Torah only records he did chesed all his life to bring people back to monotheism. But that chesed that he had done until then, in terms of its value, in terms of its effect, had very limited, relatively speaking, we'd call it infinitesimal compared to what it was afterwards. And that's why God said, go to the land I will show you. There you will succeed. You'll be among the living. But even then, it still was not at the level of after when he engaged with the angels. Because then he was the location. After this, that was after the circumcision, he's more than a mega person. He's a person with unlimited capacity, due to God being directly connected to him at a level which is the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. So Avraham himself is the pillar of living kindness, Amud HaChesed. The Gemara tells us that there's certain innate characteristics in Jews. And every Jew, it's part of his spiritual genealogy because he descends from Avraham Avinu. Jews have very unique characteristics. We are gomli chasodim. We do acts of loving kindness. And it's a known fact, per capita, every poll, irrefutable fact, there's no nation in the world which are as giving as charitable as the Jewish people. That's fact. Why? Because it's part of our genealogy. Avram was that pillar of loving kindness at a level which was nothing comparable to it. We, being direct descendants of him, we possess that same gene. It may be misdirected. What do you think Jews are head up every liberal cause in the world? Because somehow, because they don't understand, they believe that since no one assumes responsibility for certain issues, they have to take up that issue. But that's rooted in that gene. We have to act selflessly to do for others. I remember years ago, there was starvation in Biafra. Who took up the cause of Biafra? It became a Jewish cause. Why is it a Jewish cause? What should be a world cause? Why the Jewish cause? Well, you got UNICEF, you have UNESCO. But the few Jews, handful-wise, they outdo the UNESCO and they outdo UNICEF. Why? Because Jews themselves have this internal drive, which allows them and forces them almost to do act of loving kindness. So if it's misdirected, we go all over the place rather than where we should be. You know, there's an expression, charity begins at home. It's based on a verse in Prophets. You should not abandon your own flesh. If your brother is starving and you have a third party starving, whose need do you address first? The person who's closest to you. That's who you do. You know, you'd say if the Jewish people have a surplus of money, we don't know what to do. Then you do address the world cause, the world need. I mean, has every Jewish problem been addressed and financed and capitalized, and therefore we have all this extra, we give it elsewhere? The answer is because these people don't have the orientation of the Torah, giving them an understanding of what their responsibilities are. Therefore, they go where they believe they should be, and that's where they go there. But that's Avraham Avinu. It's only because we descend from Avraham, who's the founding patriarch of Jewish people, and he embedded in his genealogy this characteristic, we all possess it. Rachmanim. We have mercy, we're compassionate. It's Avraham Avinu. Conscience, shame, that's Avraham Avinu. There's no nation in the world that has shame like the Jewish people, with conscience. But that's all that. Therefore, the Torah, when it describes and evaluates the hospitality of Avraham Avinu, it only mentions this hospitality, hosting the angels, although he did it his whole life. And that was the basis for his outreach, converting people to monotheism. But there's no mention of all that. It's only here, at this point. There's an interesting midrash, which is mind-boggling, where when Sari Menu passes away, as a result of hearing and believing that Avram had slaughtered the apple of her eye, the purpose of her existence, Yitzchak, at the age of 37, Avram sought out a burial plot to bury her. It's a question that's one of the 10 tests. I mean, here the land, Canaan was given to him, which included Hebron, which was the Tomb of Machpelah, and yet he has to go purchase the plot from Ephron, who's a bad man, bad person, and he pays a fortune. Doesn't ask a question. It's my land. God said it's mine. I got to pay. it's irrelevant. He does what he has to do, and he purchases the Tumah Machpelah and that whole location to bury his wife Sarah, the matriarch. When he purchases this cave and the property and all the trees, as the Torah describes what he purchased, God says, finally now, after all these years, how old was Avraham when Sarah Imeinu passed away? If she was 127, that's how old she was when she died. He was 10 years older than she was. He was 137 years old. So 137, he's been involved through the thick and thin of chesed, of doing acts of loving kindness selflessly, even with the angels. God says, Avraham, finally, you've assumed my cloak of chesed. Finally. Ato lovish v'levushi. Now, finally, you're encloaked with my cloak. Hear the words. Until now, Avraham, you didn't do chesed. Now, finally, when you purchase the burial location for your wife, you're doing chesed. I mean, here we just spoke. The only chesed the Torah records before the purchase of Mars Machpelah is the hospitality which he offered to the angels. And what were the fruits of that hospitality? The clouds of glory, the manna, the wellspring of Miriam, which had come there for 40 years. And yet, God says when he purchased the Mars Machpelah, the two Machpelah, and that whole location, he says, finally, you've arrived where you should have arrived. Now you're finally wearing my cloak of chesed. How do we understand this? So what we explained in the past was this. When God created the world, why did he create the world? So we discussed David HaMelech. King David says in Psalms, Olam Chesed Yibodeh. The world was created purely for the sake of chesed, loving kindness. Since he wanted the human being to be the ultimate beneficiary of something which is good on the absolute level, he created a world that should be the location of challenge, that if man should succeed in his challenge, he will merit the ultimate, which is something which is good on an absolute level. That's chesed. That's olam chesed yiboneh. God created the world due to chesed. When God created the world for chesed, that was loving kindness for the sake of loving kindness. That man should be the beneficiary of this opportunity, that if he should succeed, he will be there. He will merit the ultimate. When Avram did chesed, he didn't do chesed for the sake of chesed. He used that as a vehicle to do outreach. As we said, his home had 4 entrances. So from whatever direction you would come, you could easily enter into his home. His hospitality was one of a kind. It equaled King Solomon's cuisine at the height of his power. That was the level of his accommodation, his hospitality. But why? Because when he wine and dined his guests, they would enter into a dialogue, and as a result of that, by the end of the night, they were confirmed, convinced monotheists. So did Avram do chesed for chesed? Or did Avram do chesed only as the vehicle to enter into this dialogue, to convince the person and refute every basis for paganism? It was not chesed for chesed. It was only a means to an end, which was bringing people to monotheism. That's not God's chesed. When God created the world, it was directly that man should be the beneficiary of creation. Until he purchased the burial plot for Sarah Imeinu. When he purchased the plot for Sarah Imeinu, regardless of the cost factor, it was for the sake of Sarah being accommodated with the ultimate level of burial, which is the Tumah Machpelah. As it's stated in the Midrash, When the soul ascends to heaven, the most direct ascent route is that location. So that was purely chesed for Sari Menu. That was loving kindness for loving kindness. There's no ulterior motive, meaning even with the best intent to bring people to monotheism, it was purely for her. So therefore God says, finally now, at the age of 137, when you purchase that tomb of Machpelah, now you're doing exactly my chesed. Now you're wearing my cloak. It's not a means to an end, but rather it's an end unto itself to do chesed, that the human being should be a beneficiary of your act of loving kindness. So that was the chesed. So Avraham, as we said, it's not he ran a homeless shelter. Didn't run a homeless shelter. Avraham's loving kindness was based on his wanting to convert the world to monotheism and to refute paganism and take on the world single-handedly and make a difference. And he did make a difference. After he defeated the four kings, which were the mightiest powers in the world, he was declared by the world, by all these pagans, he is the Prince of Elohim. He's the Prince of God. They never heard that word before. But because they understood, with all their deities, with all their powers, they weren't able to accomplish what Avraham was able to accomplish. Avraham single-handedly defeated the four mightiest powers. How's it possible? The answer is, because if you have Elohim backing you, there's nothing which is beyond the pale, which is not beyond the possibility, and therefore he was victorious. So, but all that was what? And that was the objective, that was the goal. And that was his purpose. And that was the thrust of his life. The hospitality of the angels. Although that was the objective, was what? As we said, he believed they were pagans. The reason why he offered the water to wash their feet, because he believed that maybe they were pagans and they worshiped the dust, and he didn't want idolatry to be tracked into his house. He says, before you come in, wash your feet, and then you'll come in. So again, all this selfless negation, prostrates himself, was only for one purpose, to make a difference in their belief. It was not they should be beneficiaries of his hospitality. At the end, when Sari Menu passed away, there was for the sake of that Sari Menu should be a beneficiary of his loving kindness. And he held back nothing. And she was, regardless of the value, the price that he paid literally a king's ransom for that, didn't make a difference. Sari Menu was deserving of that, and therefore he purchased that on her behalf.